from the All Indiana Podcast Network.
It's time for real conversation about the real issues that affect our communities.
Poverty, education, equality, and more.
This is Real Talk.
Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Welcome to Real Talk on the All Indiana Podcast Network. I'm Reverend Charles Harrison, and on this episode today, we're going to talk about all of the anti-Israel protests that we're seeing across the country on college campuses, not just here in America, but the protests that we're seeing across the world concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you so much for joining me today on Real Talk on the All Indiana Podcast Network, and I'm Reverend Charles Harrison, and I am solo today. My co-host, Reverend Terry Webster Sr., is out of town today, so it'll just be me, and I just wanted to, have a conversation today. I've been somewhat surprised. I've been somewhat disturbed, I think a little bit troubled by all of the protests that I have been seeing on television, on college campuses across the United States, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I guess I was somewhat surprised and disturbed based on what had happened, almost 2 weeks ago, when Hamas came into southern Israel and killed almost 1,300 people. Many of those were elderly and children and young people who were at a kind of a peace event. And then the description of how some of the children were killed. And I was just horrified by that and the barbarity of that really just troubled me. Many of you know that I am a nonviolent person and I believe in nonviolence, but I recognize sometimes there are events that occur, in our world that makes nonviolent difficult to pursue. To try to resolve conflict. I recognize that, and certainly with the work I do with 10 Point, tragically, I see it too often. But I felt like there was a lot of sympathy for Israel and Jews all across the world, and particularly those who live in Israel, based on what was done, and I felt like I was certainly horrified by it. And I'm a person who believes in the two-state solution. I do believe that the Palestinians, ought to have some self-determination and control their own state and their part of the land within Israel. I wish we would have achieved that by now, but certainly we have not. And my argument has been that there is no justification in pursuing any cause that causes you to massacre people and to rape women and then to take hostages, nearly 200 hostages, into Gaza. And I know people say, well, they're fighting for their liberation, but you don't do that. And I often speak of the plight of Black America in this country after 400 years of slavery, and our struggle for civil rights, in the 1950s and 1960s, certainly with Dr. King and the civil rights leaders. And Dr. King really believed in the power of nonviolence. He believed that love had to undergird the movement, the love for God and to love for your neighbor as yourself. And that was the approach. Certainly we had just cause as Black Americans to be filled with rage and anger when we talk about the dehumanization of slavery and its impact on Black Americans and all of the blacks that died, in the transition from Africa even to get to America on those ships as they were chained in the bottom of those ships, and many died. Many of my ancestors died, let alone many African Americans, that were killed, during slavery and the way they were treated and stuff. Yeah, there were many blacks that was angry and filled with rage because of, the 400 years of slavery in this country and the way Black Americans were treated like animals, or some even beneath animals. But yet in our cause for justice, for equality, for freedom, we chose a different path. Dr. King once said that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can. He said hatred cannot drive out hatred, only love can. And I believe that there is a higher calling and purpose if you want to be on the higher moral ground in your quest for freedom. I do sympathize with the Palestinians and their quest for liberation and freedom in Israel, and to be able to have self-determination, and they determine their own direction and be able to live as free men and women. But what I do not support is the use of violence and what happened almost 2 weeks ago in the massacre of people. I think that was wrong. I think that was horrible. I think that was evil. I think that was wicked. And as a Christian minister, certainly I do not support that. And I was surprised, in stating that, in the position that I saw young people taking all across this country on college campuses, when, as I looked at it, it seemed to be pro-Hamas in their rallies, what seemed to be against Israel. I was somewhat disturbed because it seemed like there was a lot of anti-Jewish rhetoric, anti-Semitism that was being displayed. And I was trying to understand where that was coming from. Why was there so many young people protesting what had just happened in Israel and siding what it seemed like with the Hamas? I think all of us agree that we need to address the issue in Palestine. I think we can agree on that. But I'm not for sure how it is achieved with Hamas in control of Gaza, and they chose a path of violence and wickedness and evil, in my mind, to try to address their plight. And I guess I'm disturbed in trying to figure out what's going on in America today. Is there a large anti-Jewish sentiment in America today? Or are we just seeing it on college campuses? And if we're seeing it on college campuses, what's going on these college campuses, whether it's Cornell or Harvard or whatever college it took place on, what's being taught there? Is anti-Semitism being taught on these college campuses? And if so, where is this coming from? It would seem like to me there should have been some sympathy, some acknowledgement of the horrific act of Hamas in what they did in southern Israel, in the killing of children, the elderly and young people who gathered in large numbers for a peace event. I don't know if it's true or not about children and babies being burned or beheaded, but if that is true, that's horrible. And how can you rally and protest around that? I'm confused about that. I'm troubled about that. And I wonder, what does that say now about our country? I believe in free speech. I believe that we ought to debate these issues. But there has to be some acknowledgement of what had happened. It's just like when it came out about the hospital in Gaza that was supposedly bombed. Automatically on Twitter, you started seeing some in the media and some political figures automatically jump to a conclusion that because Hamas said it, that Israel had bombed the hospital, that it became reality. When after the fog of war, we discovered that that was not true, that the Islamic Jihad fired a missile that misfired and ended up falling on the parking lot in the hospital, killing a number of people, which was tragic. It was sad. I'm not for sure that 500 people were killed, as they allegedly said it was. I just heard a report just yesterday that it may have been around 100 people, but it also led to more protests across this country on college campuses that were anti-Israel. Now, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about that because it seems like there may be anti-Semitism running rampant in this country. Now, maybe my perception of it is wrong, but it is my perception, and I think it is the perception of other people that maybe something is going on in these college campuses that is promoting anti-Semitism. And if that is the case, it's disturbing. I know a lot of alumni of many of these colleges are also disturbed about this. I'm disturbed particularly when it comes from some of our Ivy League colleges, and many of these individuals tend to end up being leaders in our nation. It is disturbing that we may have leaders in our nation in the future as young people who are getting their degrees that may be anti-Semitic. That's troubling to me. That we may have in America today a growing anti-Israel movement or sentiment. I think that is disturbing. I'm thankful that our president gave a speech last night to the nation and showed his support and tried to clarify for our nation what really happened. That Israel was not responsible for the bombing of the hospital, and that Israel had a right to bring to justice those who had committed those horrific acts in Israel that led to the death of 1,300 people. I know some of you are going to argue with me, well, Rev Harrison, what about all the innocent Palestinians that have been killed? I am concerned about that. But I also will raise the issue with you. Why has Hamas used civilians as a shield? Why have they hidden among civilians in Gaza? Why are they putting the people who they say they represent as the political leadership in Gaza in jeopardy? You cannot start a fight and then run and hide among the civilians. If you're going to pick a fight with Israel, then fight them. But don't pick a fight, massacre people, take hostages, and then go run and hide among the civilians. I'm troubled by that. I wish we didn't have any violence over there in Israel and in Gaza or the West Bank. And now the potential of the spreading of violence in Lebanon among Hezbollah. And certainly Iran is behind this. I don't want to see a war that spreads and becomes a regional war in that part of the world, and what its impact may be on the rest of the world. But certainly the solution is not to have this anti-Semitic sentiment in this country, as we see around many Arab countries in the Middle East. I think we have to address this issue as Americans. I think we have to figure out what's going on with young people, particularly on our college campuses, that they have this anti-Israel viewpoint. I think we need to have discussions about that because this is troubling. I stand with you for the liberation of the Palestinian people, but it has to be done with nonviolence rather than violence. And we have to be willing to pursue it as long as it takes with nonviolence, because violence will not produce the results that the Palestinian people want and what they deserve. And having anti-Israel protests in cities across the country, on college campuses, and even in the Capitol building is not going to move the needle to get us to where people want to go, which is to see the creation of a two-state solution in Israel. We have to have a higher moral standard as Americans than what I'm seeing. I'm not saying that we blindly follow Israel. If Israel does the wrong thing, then we need to be able to stand up and say that as a nation. If they kill innocent women and children for unjust cause, then we need to be able to stand up and call it out. But you cannot expect them, after what happened, not to respond and try to hold accountable those who are responsible for what has just happened in their country. I'm hoping that in the end, we can find real peace in that part of the world. But I say to our young people on college campuses, your protests that seem to be based on misinformation will not lead to that. We cannot, as a nation, become anti-Semitic. We cannot, as a nation, be anti-Israel. I'm hoping that on these college campuses, this gets addressed with the board of directors, with the presidents of these universities, where people who are pro-Israel are not in fear of their own safety because they are fearful of speaking out against what they believe is wrong. And we hear that is the case. We must be just and fair as Americans. I know this is a complicated issue. But we must stand for what is right. We must stand for peace. And we cannot support individuals who commit a terrorist act, which was done in southern Israel, where over 1,300 people were killed, and rally in support for that. That is wrong. That is wrong, and we cannot justify that. That is wrong. We have to figure out a better way. And I believe we can. I believe what President Biden is saying is the path that we ought to take. I believe many of our congressional leaders are also on the right track. We must rid terrorism in Israel and then work for a two-state solution that provides security for the Palestinians and for the people of Israel. If there's going to be real peace, then there must be security for both Israel and the Palestinians as they live together side by side. And we need to prevent countries like Iran from interfering in that peace and putting us on a pathway of destruction and conflict with one another. Let's be wise. Let's keep our eyes open. And let's stand on the side of what's right, what's just, and what's fair. This is Rev Harrison and my commentary on Real Talk. Thank you so much for joining me today as I shared my feelings about what's going on in our country with the pro-Palestinian protests, which I believe have really been pro-Hamas rallies and protests. But thank you so much for joining me. I'm Reverend Charles Harrison, and this has been Real Talk. Join me next time as I bring more real talk about the real issues that affect our communities here in Indianapolis and across the country. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast and share it on Facebook and Twitter. We're now recording it, so you can also follow us on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I pray that you have a blessed and awesome day. This is Reverend Harrison.
This is Real Talk with Reverend Charles Harrison.
Be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast.
And be sure to check out other great podcasts on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Online now at allindianapodcast.com.